This next video is going to cover activities 6 through 9, and it's the second meaning of liberty, living under a government that does not harm the person and property of its citizens. So the picture I'm using now to illustrate this meaning of liberty is like the one we saw before, except now instead of a bad person hurting people, it's a bad government hurting people. And I have the question mark here because the question is, what's going to keep government from harming us? And as we'll see in the class, the American system of government has a number of features that are designed to keep government from harming its own citizens. So let's begin with activity 6. This activity begins with a very famous quote from James Madison. We saw earlier where Madison says that if men were angels, we would not need government, meaning that people wouldn't harm each other. If we were angels, we wouldn't go around harming other people, and we wouldn't need any government to protect us. He now adds also that if angels were governing us, we wouldn't need anything to protect us from government because government wouldn't harm us. But because people are in our government, not angels, there's always this danger that government would harm people, and so there needs to be something done to keep that from happening. Letter B is another good quotation to consider for your midterm writing assignment. This is a very clear definition of liberty in the sense of government not harming people. What William Penn says here, and he was one of the original founders of the American system back in the 1600s in Pennsylvania. He says this happy frame of government, called in Englishman's liberty, is to be freed in your person and estate from arbitrary violence and oppression. The word arbitrary here refers to the actions of the government. So he's talking about oppression and violence from government. So to be free, a person has to not be harmed by his or her own government. Letter C is from a historian, Paul Johnson, and he just points out that in the 20th century, if you look around the world, many countries were harming their own citizens in terms of person and property, and we're not talking here about in wars, but governments actually turning against their own citizens and wrongly imprisoning them, taking their lives, etc. We'll see more of that in activities to come. But he points out that 125 million people lost their lives to violence from governments. This happened almost not at all in the United States, which I think shows that the design of our system of governments is a very excellent one and prevents this from happening. Letter D is a quotation that I use a lot because it's one of the first ones that I use to really understand our system. And MacDonald says, common sense teaches us that we need the protection that the sovereign provides against our fellow man, the sovereign here being government. So it's clear that we need a government there to protect us from being harmed by other people. But then he says that history teaches us that people also need protection from government. So that's the theme of this activity, the need to have protection from government so that we can live in peace and not be harmed by our own government. Activity 7 are just some examples of places where people have been harmed by their own government. For example, letter A is about Cambodia, and when the Khmer Rouge took power in the 1970s in Cambodia, that government killed 2 million Cambodians, dying by starvation, torture, execution, etc. Something similar happens in North Korea, where people are put to death or imprisoned and tortured simply for opposing the government or being a relative of someone who opposes the government. It's as if a president of the United States was to put in prison or execute everybody of the opposing party. Thankfully, that doesn't happen in the U.S., but in countries like North Korea, it does. Similar in Iraq, that the opponents of Saddam Hussein were tortured, executed by Saddam. So all of these countries I've just mentioned, Cambodia, North Korea, and Iraq, are examples of countries that do not enjoy this meaning of liberty, of living under a government that does not harm its own citizens. Finally, activity 9 is the liberty analysis. And so, just as we did before, we're going to be considering Supreme Court cases and which side winning, which party winning, would promote the meaning of liberty that we're talking about. Right now we're talking about living under a government that does not harm its own citizens. So in letter A, Griswold versus Connecticut, this is a case from the 1960s where the state of Connecticut made it illegal for women to use birth control pills, basically. This is a freedom of choice case. This is not a case where government is causing any physical harm on anybody. So this would be a case where this meaning of liberty does not apply to this case because the government is not harming anybody. That is, not murdering, raping, or stealing, etc., wrongly imprisoning anybody. Loving versus Virginia, letter B, that's the same situation where this is a freedom of choice case. Can a person choose to marry somebody of a different race? That is an important question, and we'll be studying that in the personal liberties section later in the book. But in terms of just government not harming somebody, the government of Virginia is not harming anybody in their person and property. There is a ruling that the Lovings would have to leave the state, but this is all done with due process. Nobody's being imprisoned or banished without a trial. So this is not a case about wrongful imprisonment or physical harm coming to somebody from government. Same with letter C. Government is not harming anybody directly in this case. It does not apply to Roe v. Wade, this meaning of liberty, because if the fetus is a person or not, government's not performing the abortion. Government's not harming anybody. Government's not harming Roe. It's a personal choice issue case. So neither side winning with promote liberty does not apply. In the case of letter D, this is a controversial case, Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, where we sent forces to Afghanistan after 9/11. There was a military conflict that took place there, and the American U.S. military and coalition forces captured a number of people fighting against us from the Taliban or Al-Qaeda who were fighting against us, and some of those people were brought to Guantanamo Bay. So the question is it okay to detain somebody without a trial who's been captured in a situation like that on a battlefield? That question is important, and the Supreme Court has made rulings that there is a need for some sort of trial. But just in terms of liberty, just think back to what this meaning of liberty is all about. It's how can we design a government that will protect its citizens but not harm its citizens? Now, in the case of Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, Hamdan is not a citizen. Hamdan is part of a organization that has attacked the U.S. and has been captured on a battlefield. So this meaning of liberty really doesn't apply to this case because the U.S. government is not being accused of harming its own citizens. That doesn't mean that the U.S. government can go around doing whatever it wants to people unjustly. That's a separate question. But just narrowly looking at it in terms of liberty, this meaning of liberty does not apply because the government is not harming one of its own citizens.